All right, hello everyone again. So we're jumping back into our second motivation for our nested F test. And for this one, we're going to start talking about having a categorical predictor in our regression model that has more than two categories. So we've spent a decent amount of time already talking about categorical predictors, but remember all the ones that we've talked about have just had two categories, either male or female, yes or no, red wine or white wine, etc. And so if we have a categorical variable that has more than two categories, then we decided before that we were going to end up needing more indicator variables. And so if k is the number of categories, we're going to need k minus 1 indicator variables. And so I think this will kind of be more clear just with an example. And so the example that we're going to work with now, as well as on the R section, is this gun violence data. And so we might be interested in looking at the association between mortality due to gun violence, and that's a number of deaths per 100,000 people in each state, and gun ownership, so the percent of people who own a gun in each state. And so we have observations for each of the 50 US states. But we also might think that average mortality could differ for different regions of the country, even at a fixed gun ownership level. And so we've divided the country into 4 different regions: the West, the Midwest, the South, and the Northeast. And so because now we have these 4 different categories, to include this region variable in our model, we're going to need 3 different indicator variables. And so let's go ahead and define each of those indicator variables here. And I'm going to define them so that they match up with our R output that we'll see in a second. And so we might want an indicator variable for the Northeast region. So that gets a 1 if the state is in the Northeast, and a 0 otherwise, or a 0 if the state is not in the Northeast. Then we need 1 for the South. And so that's going to be a 1 if the state is in the South, and a 0 otherwise. And finally, we need 1 for the West, defined in kind of the same way. So a 1 if the state is in the West, 0 otherwise. Whichever region doesn't get an indicator variable, we're going to call that our reference group. And we're going to see why it's called a reference group in a second. And so our reference group in this case is the Midwest, because that is the region that we didn't give an indicator variable for our model. Now, in this case, we want parallel lines for each of the different regions of the country. So we're not considering a non-parallel lines model yet. We'll look at that in the R Markdown file for today. So this parallel lines model, you could start writing it out in a similar way as if we just had 2 categories in our categorical variable. And so plus the error, that would look like a kind of our standard parallel lines model for a variable with 2 categories. Now that we have more than 2 categories, we just need to add the other indicator terms to our model. These indicator terms are going to end up giving us a different parallel line for each region. And so we're not going to write this out super explicitly, but you could see that the intercept for the Northeast region is going to end up being beta naught plus beta 2. The intercept for the South region is going to end up being beta naught plus beta 3. And the intercept for the west region is going to end up being beta naught plus beta 4. Our reference group is going to get zeros for all these, and so the intercept for the Midwest is just going to be beta naught. When we introduced this before, we had practiced writing out the regression model for each of the categories, and we could do the same thing now. And so for the Northeast, I'm just